In the era around 9/11, there was this discussion about Muslims in Western societies and how come it is that these Muslims have sympathy with the people of Afghanistan rather than the British objective of being part of this coalition to invade Afghanistan, and focus on the aspects of Islam that they thought made them different. They were criticizing Western society, saying we assumed after the fall of the Berlin Wall that history had ended and that there was no need for any civilizational ideas to be discussed in a kind of meaningful way that brought people together in society. So let's try and identify those things that make us authentically British. And immediately that they started doing that, you started to get political divisions. So people on the more conservative end of the spectrum identify Britishness as something which was very much rooted in history. The way I was taught history at school was chronological. It was the Roman conquest of Britain, the Angles and Saxons, the Norman invasion, the Plantagenets, Tudors, Stuarts, the formation of the United Kingdom, the world wars in the 20th century. An English person whose family had been here for generations, their story was formed out of that story. This is what made them British. And a lot of the values that aligned with that, whether they were Christian, whether they were nationalistic or patriotic, whether they were to do with democracy because of the formation of parliament, all of that came out of that story. But then people on the kind of more liberal end of the spectrum or globalist end of the spectrum had a problem with that history, because if you're not white, British, probably Protestant as well, that story really doesn't fit with you. So how do we get a society to coalesce around values where we got many, many people who don't come from that background, whether they're African Caribbean, whether they're from South Asia, whether they're originally Irish, or whether they're from Europe in more recent times. So then they started to try and identify values like tolerance and democracy and like these kind of themes. And so to this day, you'll never find left and right or liberal and conservative unifying on what are British values. When I think of myself as a Muslim, whether you come to values from the point of view of your history, your story, or whether you come to values from the point of view of principles, these two are really very much in harmony. They're not in opposition, which often you find that the discussion about values in secular societies, they're often in opposition. The story is often in opposition to values that they profess to believe in that come from the Enlightenment. The values which come from the Quran and the Sunnah, the principles that we uphold and believe in, are very much aligned with the story that comes to us. Isn't it amazing that you and I, from very different backgrounds, we share a common story that starts from the Prophet Adam alayhi salam, going through the prophets mentioned in the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam and his companions, and the great figures of Islam that have come in the world, and all the ups and downs we've seen, particularly in the last century. That is your story and my story. And the values that we believe in, they're universal because they belong to you and me and everybody else who identifies as a Muslim. The goodness that we know from the Quran and the example and the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam